Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Do you remember, it just occurred to me listening to Simon's Bulletin, that we began to speculate very cautiously a few months ago about the weird relationship between so-called alt-right or neo-fascist positions and sexual frustration. Do you remember? The contention was that an awful lot of this anger came from an inability to get a girlfriend and a hatred of women that can be easily translated into hatred of minorities. This killing in Toronto, the man who stands accused of ploughing his van into pedestrians, it appears to be the proof of that particular pudding. We'll have a little look at that later in the programme. But it's almost impossible to understand until you start looking at the kind of toxicity that is now fairly commonplace online. There's even a name for it, incel, I-N-C-E-L, which is an abbreviation for involuntarily celibate. Apparently he identified himself as that, this Alec Minassian character. It's become a little bit pithy, hasn't it, to say, I wonder who radicalised him, you know, when the Finsbury mosque attack, terror attack occurred, or when Joe Cox was murdered. We all know who radicalised these people. I just wonder when everybody else is going to be comfortable saying it in public. Who radicalised the involuntary celibate movement? We'll have a look at that later in the programme. I think we ran out of time yesterday, but a couple of things fell into place for me yesterday with regard to the Alfie Evans tragedy and the echoes that it has of the Charlie Gard one. And it is, once again, to do with what you'd call extreme right-wing ideology. Well, why on earth would people with fascistic leanings in this country be getting involved in medical cases? I was very baffled at the time during the Charlie Gard case by some of the distinctly unsavoury characters who turned up at the hospital doors with camera crews in tow. But it is, of course, coming from, as so much in this country that is ugly at the moment is coming from. It's coming from the dark money on the far right of American politics, who of course use cases like this to persuade American people that socialised healthcare is a bad thing. So we'll have a proper look at that story later in the programme, with the caveat, of course, that we feel nothing but sympathy for Alfie Evans's parents. And then the bog-offs. I like this story, but it does, to me, seem to be the wrong medicine for a real illness. The idea that the government will ban some of the promotions in supermarkets that encourage us to fill our trolleys with even more unhealthy food than we would have done otherwise. If it's not hitting the people making the profits, I suspect it's not going to work. And then there is, of course, some evidence to back up that theory, and it is only a theory. It'd be more than welcome to knock it down, but there's some evidence to back up that theory, I think, with the £1 billion that was wiped off the share prices of gambling companies yesterday. But we begin, and I do this with a slightly heavy heart, because it's clear to me that some of the conversations that unsavoury people don't want you to have are not being had enough. So let's begin by getting all the controversial stuff out there early, and then you can start throwing balls at my coconuts to your heart's content. One tweet came in earlier that I think perhaps helps people like me to understand what anti-Semitism can mean in the context of the Labour Party. So without going into too much detail, someone sent me some video footage of what appears to be, and I will describe it to you, but I've got no reason to doubt its veracity, but it is, for my purposes at least, unverified. It appears to show 3 members of the Israeli Defence Force being filmed while chatting and joking about firing rubber bullets at Palestinian protesters who are, as far as I can glean from the footage, because you can't see them, apparently throwing stones towards the soldiers, although given that the soldiers are talking about how a rubber bullet won't reach the protesters, I think we can fairly conclude that the stones wouldn't have reached the soldiers. So I get a tweet about half an hour ago, not saying, James, please talk about this on your show, or James, why don't you talk about this on your show? It isn't a subject that we would ordinarily consider to be among the 3 most important issues facing ourselves, me and you. That's generally important and or interesting. But it didn't say, why don't you? It said, why can't you? And that makes it anti-Semitic. Bear with me if you don't understand why. Because the implication there is that because it is Israeli Defense Force troops apparently joking about shooting at Palestinian protesters, that somehow the way that the country is structured, and the media in particular is structured, I would somehow be forbidden from discussing this. I would somehow be prevented from discussing this. Not why don't you talk about this, but why can't you talk about this? So I think an awful lot of people who perhaps deny anti-Semitism within the Labour Party are looking in the wrong direction. That doesn't look like Holocaust denial. That doesn't look like a depiction of Jewish people as being somehow fundamentally suspect or inferior. But it is very, very clearly subscribing to a school of thought that says Jewish influence or Israeli influence, as a clear conflation of the two, deliberately skews media coverage of issues. Now, I have had my coverage of Middle Eastern issues skewed, but it was skewed by me, and it was skewed partly as a result of fear. It works. These orchestrated campaigns accusing people of anti-Semitism work. It makes you think twice about going into a conversation about Israel, and it takes, I mean, it takes some fairly robust girding of the loins to wade back in again. I remember the first time it happened, going back years now, 10 or more, and I couldn't actually believe it. I went through, I've told you this a couple of times recently, I went through every email I got accusing me of anti-Semitism for criticising an Israeli government military campaign, and I replied to them. And about half of the replies that came back sought to escalate the accusation. Some of them were quite, forgive me, but were a bit bonkers. And about half said sorry. So, of course, I'm not suggesting that you would sympathise with proper anti-Semitism. I get a bit carried away. So it was worthwhile, but of course the next time we did it, there were a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand accusations, and you can't reply to them all individually. So it's important to work out what we mean by it. And one of the biggest parts of it is the accusation. I think the phone lines are open. You can start picking holes. You can start, I'm going to use this phrase, I think. You can start throwing balls at my coconuts to your heart's content, all right? Just let me get them set out. I think this idea that there are secret powers working. And you've heard people say that Jews exercise disproportionate power in America. You've heard me describe a tweet that says, why can't you talk about it? You've heard people somehow seek to conflate the religion of a company's owner with a political bias, or with a sort of conspiratorial air. So it seems to me that when we've struggled together in the past to pinpoint precisely what these problems are, we perhaps are thinking, well, no one here is putting up the kind of posters that were commonplace in 1930s Germany, so there isn't any anti-Semitism. But something like that, I think that is anti-Semitic. A tweet that says, why can't you talk about this? These apparent abuses being visited upon Palestinian protesters by IDF soldiers. Of course, I just did, which completely gives a lie to the suggestion that I can't. But if I choose not to, it's because I don't think it's the most interesting thing for you and I to concern ourselves with today. I do, however, think that the Labour Party's continuing problems in this field are among the most interesting things we could be talking about today. But I'm going to caveat that as well by saying that I don't buy into conspiracy theories, as I've just proved to you, and I don't believe in conscious bias on the part of colleagues in the media, particularly one thinks of the BBC. But I do think it is odd that the Labour Party's anti-Semitism problems are in many corners of the British media getting a lot more attention than the unfolding Windrush scandal. The Windrush scandal, make no mistake, has seen a British Prime Minister knowingly terrorise innocent elderly British people with no consequences. That is incredible. That is, for me, a dilution of British values on a scale that I haven't seen in my lifetime. A British Prime Minister can terrorise innocent, elderly citizens of this nation and go completely unpunished. If If I was in charge, that would be on the front of every newspaper in the country until some consequence is visited upon Theresa May. But we did 2 hours on it yesterday, so I make no apology for focusing on the Labour Party's problems today. With that caveat, they don't seem to me to be problems on anything like the scale that Windrush represents. I don't understand why the weight given to these two controversies appears, to me at least, to be so different. But I do know that if I hired a former political editor of the Daily Mail as my chief spokesman and a former editor of the Daily Politics programme on the BBC as my director of communications, I would very much be hoping that they would earn their money by making sure that their former employers were focusing more upon Jeremy Corbyn's problems than on Theresa May's. And Theresa May did indeed hire a former political editor of the Daily Mail as her chief spokesman and a former editor of the Daily Politics programme as her director of communications. So they deserve a pay rise. I think we can all agree on that. James Slack and Robbie Gibb should be putting in for a pay rise out of the public purse as soon as possible, because Jeremy Corbyn's anti-Semitism controversy doesn't strike me in the first instance as deserving anything like the outrage and coverage that Theresa May's deliberate and knowing persecution of innocent British pensioners deserves. But I digress. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. The question then is this: what does Corbyn need to do? 0345 6060 973. You can come at it from whatever angle you want. You can answer variations on that theme. We're not going to confine ourselves to train tracks. We're not going to confine ourselves to binary responses. Be as nuanced, be as complicated as you please. But ultimately, if you are troubled, offended, hurt, scared by some of the anti-Semitic sentiments expressed by some members of the Labour Party, that is Jeremy Corbyn's description of his own party, not mine. My party and I are sorry for the hurt and distress caused. We have not done enough to get to grips with the problem, and for that the Jewish community and our own Jewish members deserve an apology. He acknowledged party processes to tackle incidents of anti-Semitism had simply not been fully fit for purpose. We did not look closely enough at ourselves. This is pretty uncompromising stuff for a man who ordinarily finds it impossible to admit that he's been responsible for any mistakes, almost as impossible as his most ardent supporters find it. So what does he need to do? 0345 6060 973. Because you can go after Holocaust denial and you can go after 1930s style tropes and you can go after what I would call obvious anti-Semitism, but particularly with reference to the Palestinian movement, of which Jeremy Corbyn has been a key member for decades. How do you tackle it there when it's under the surface, when it's things like people believing that a journalist like me is deliberately prevented from talking about Israeli soldiers shooting Palestinian protesters, or Israeli politicians saying that wishing death upon protesters? That's the problem, because that is anti-Semitic. It's claiming that Jewish people somehow gag or control people like me. And of course, if you believe that they do, you probably won't see it as anti-Semitic. And if you don't believe that they do, you may not be aware of how widespread that perception is. That's Jeremy Corbyn's biggest problem. You can go after the big ticket stuff quite easily, I would have thought. But the underlying sense that things are controlled by shady Jewish cabals, that belief is rather hard, that boil is rather harder to lance, isn't it? So how do you think he should do it? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's 10:17. We'll park for the moment the question of why Theresa May's terrorising of innocent British pensioners appears to be of less concern to much of the British media than Jeremy Corbyn's inadequate responses to anti-Semitism within his own party. I think probably with those two appointments of key Downing Street personnel, we've answered the question of how that can happen, but it is still an important issue, and it's a question which I would like you to answer. What does Jeremy Corbyn need to do to regain your confidence as a British Jew who might historically have had Labour Party sympathies or supported the Labour Party, might still do, but who feels that he is failing to tackle this particular problem? And second sort of element of the question then would become, what do you think the problem is? 0345 6060 973. It's 21 minutes after 10. You can email, text or tweet. But in the first instance, the two questions are, what does he need to do? And what do you think the problem is? Because there isn't a consensus on that, somewhat oddly. Trevor's in Finchley. Trevor, what do you think?
I tell you, one of the basic problems, James, is that you can't suddenly have a couple of meetings with the Jewish community, make a few apologies, and expect a deep-rooted problem to disappear. They say a fish rots first from the head. Now, he's the head of an organisation and a person who's been deeply involved and associated with people and organisations that are, unethical to Israel and the Jews generally. And I think you can't suddenly disassociate yourself from these relationships.
When you use the phrase deep-rooted problem, there's a slight danger that we divide along two lines here. Is it people who are absolutely convinced that there is a deep-rooted problem and people who are absolutely convinced that there isn't, and never the twain shall meet? I kind of sit between both of those positions and ask you to describe or to provide evidence of his particular personal deep-rooted problem with these issues.
Okay. So there's two things that I would draw attention to. The meetings he's had in the Commons with individuals who have said some outrageous thing about Jews, and I can't remember the fellow's name that had suggested that Jews had used, the old blood libel of using blood from children to be used.
I mean, you put us in a slightly invidious position by not being able to remember his name, and I think if it's the one that I've heard referred to in the past, Jeremy Corbyn has professed a degree of ignorance about the man's full back catalogue, which I think is probably fair, isn't it? I mean, do you check the last 30 years of pronouncements of everybody you meet with?
I think that as a leader of an opposition...
But he's not, though, is he? He was an obscure backbencher when he did the thing you describe.
But he no longer is. He has a...
Yeah, so has he done it while being leader?
No, I think that the mural, for example, which he dismissed. You see, there's the problem. It's to do with the intelligence of someone who may be Prime Minister.
I think the mural was profoundly anti-Semitic, and I think Jeremy Corbyn is far from the most intelligent member of Parliament. But you did say deep-rooted problem, and I did say evidence, and you did say a bloke whose name I can't remember who said some awful things and had a meeting with him long before he became leader. That's where people go, that doesn't sound like a deep-rooted problem to me.
Okay, so my
try again, maybe.
Would be this. My issue would be this: when Hitler wrote Mein Kampf in prison in 1923.
Yeah, we don't really think we can blame Jeremy Corbyn for that.
No. What I'm saying is that these were his associations, which even go back years, suggest the predisposition towards a way of thinking. That way of thinking hasn't necessarily disappeared.
So you're reading his mind now.
And I'm reading that he comes from a position which has, I think, a rather hostile attitude towards Israel. Israel is obviously a Jewish...
Hostility towards Israel is not quite the same as anti-Semitism.
No,
That's kind of one of the key points. And I'm going to keep pulling you back to that phrase, deep-rooted problem, because so far you've cited a bloke whose name you can't remember who met with him before he was leader, and you've mentioned Mein Kampf.
Okay, let me put it this way. Okay.
Third time lucky, Trevor.
Okay, last opportunity then. So he has, since he's come on board as leader, headed an organisation whose members have felt much more comfortable in making anti-Semitic statements in public and on social media.
Yes.
The fact that he is leader...
That seems reasonable.
And the fact that he's leader of an organisation and his members feel that they are comfortable under his leadership to make these rather insulting and degrading and derogatory comments suggests to me that they feel comfortable that he shares.
Yes, there we go. Now we've got something. I don't know that that's evidence.
That very disturbing.
I find that disturbing as well, and I think that is the problem he has to address, the boil he has to lance. It's not evidence of a deep-rooted problem. It's evidence of his followers perhaps having deep-rooted problems, not him.
This hasn't just been
No, but you can point at things he hasn't done and say that the fact that people feel comfortable doing them under his name or under his leadership speaks of a problem. I'm not going to dispute that. Others may. So how does he fix that? How can he...
Well, let me ask you a question then.
No, that's not how it works. How does he deal with people who think that he represents something he claims indeed insists he doesn't represent, because you and I would hate to be held responsible for the views of people we disagree with. If I said, oh, here's someone claiming to speak for Trevor in Finchley, and they said something vile, and I said, Trevor in Finchley, how are you going to deal with this? Because they speak for you. How are you going to deal with that?
Okay, I think that when people are called to account for statements they've made or written on social media that get into the public space and are vehemently anti-Semitic and have been insulting, and the case in point where these MPs have cited, who had this debate in Parliament last week, one after the other.
It was incredibly powerful, and we covered it at the time, but it was pointed out to me afterwards that Twitter is full of people claiming to be things that they are not, and the burden of proof when making these accusations should actually lie with the victim of the abuse. You can't really prove that sticking hashtag JC4PM on the end of a tweet is evidence that, A, that person is actually a Jeremy Corbyn supporter, and I don't think you'd even begin to try to argue that it's evidence that Jeremy Corbyn somehow agrees with the sentiments expressed in the tweet. So the question then becomes, and this, it seems to me, is the heart of the issue, how does Jeremy Corbyn take responsibility for things he's not responsible for? Because that's what you're asking him to do.
No, but he's responsible for the conduct of those that hide under the...
no, he's not, though, is he? He's not responsible. Go on.
No, but under the umbrella of standing for Labour or being a Labour supporter and being, more importantly, a member of the Labour Party, if these people are found...
But you don't know that they're members of the Labour Party, the people who sent those tweets. See, everything you cite as evidence of the deep-rooted problem is quite easy to portray as not being a deep-rooted problem at all.
There are people standing at the local elections, councillors who have made rather unfortunate comments, hostile comments, which have been called to account. These people should be dismissed from the Labour Party, not allowed to stand under that banner.
Well, he would argue that they are being, but the process is quite lengthy, and rightly, it's complicated. People have the right to a fair hearing, and the burden of proof again lies with the accusers on this occasion. So everything you've said is
accelerated. You can't
right. So there we go. So we're not talking about the people who send anonymous tweets. We're not talking about the people who post stuff and somehow seem to think that they've been enabled or facilitated by Jeremy Corbyn's position. We're not talking about any of the abuse visited upon MPs, because unless there's proof of where it came from, you can't conclude that it's come from either Labour Party supporters or Jeremy Corbyn fans. We're talking about the established cases of people being brought to account for saying things you consider to be vile being investigated, and your answer to what he can do is hurry up.
Well, there has to, as a leader, there is
I'm going to ask for a yes or no. That is your answer. It's taken us a long time to get there. But what you're saying now is they've identified the problem. A lot of the stuff I offered up as evidence of a personal deep-rooted problem has turned out not to be.
I don't accept that proposition.
Okay, so prove to me that these tweets came from Labour Party members.
No, I can't prove that.
Right, so they've turned out not to be evidence of personal deep-rooted problems, and the solution for you is you'd like to see him doing more and doing it more quickly.
No, I just find it. Listen. Just in terms of even if Jeremy can never, I do believe that Jeremy is against racism. I do believe he is against anti-Semitism as a notion. I do believe that genuinely.
But you need to see him doing more and more quickly.
As the leader of a party which has tremendous support, that is capable in the next election of becoming our Prime Minister and the ruling party, he is under a moral responsibility to ensure that party represents a moral dimension of being able to have...
yes, but we can dance around this as much as you want. What we're concluding is the investigations into acts that have already been identified and are already underway need to be speeded up, to which their answer would be, systemic. And Ken Livingstone is a very good example. The disciplinary action against him, many people have said, should be quicker. Corbyn says it will be resolved by the end of July. And I don't know that is necessarily evidence of a deep-rooted problem. It's 10:30. I shouldn't really pay any attention to it. I hope you'll be having a similar conversation about Mrs May and racism that you're having about Jeremy Corbyn and anti-Semitism today, James. So you get 1 million people watching clips of me describing Theresa May as morally corrupt, but a Jeremy Corbyn fan turns on the radio today, hears me talking in a very even-handed fashion about anti-Semitism and concludes that this is all part of some anti-Jezza conspiracy. Therein lies the problem. I enjoyed talking to Trevor. I think that Trevor enjoyed talking to me, but we reach too quickly for phrases like deep-rooted problem. We reach too quickly for evidence. There is a problem within Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. I would say it's a problem particularly connected to the pro-Palestinian position, which is a noble and defensible position, but which leaches into not just anti-Israeli rhetoric, but anti-Jewish rhetoric. Language is very important. You could say occupied territory, or you could say illegal settlement, and both would be accurate under various readings. But what can Jeremy Corbyn do to assuage the very real fears of very real Labour supporters that he has created a safe space for anti-Semitism in his party? And I think that tweet I got earlier has been really helpful to me, because I grew up thinking that anti-Semitism, I didn't understand it, to be honest with you. I've told you this before. It's one of the biggest lessons I've learned since doing this job. It's understanding Israel. Because despite being born in 1972, which is closer to the end of the Second World War than we are now to my birth, it makes you feel a bit old and weird, I always thought that anti-Semitism was alien to my species, some weird aberration that grew up in very, very specific, almost unique circumstances in the first half of the last century in Germany. And events since, the outbreak of really toxic racism that we've seen blight our own islands, the election of Donald Trump to the presidency of America, there are now Nazis marching without masks, burning swastikas on American streets. It is becoming normalized. And suddenly, about 18 months ago, I understood Israel. And I also understood the, to my mind, often excessive defense of everything Israel does. Because that's where you go, if you're Jewish, next time. And one thing that I've been taught by Donald Trump's rise, by the so-called alt-right, by the normalization of fascism, by people whose positions on everything from, I suppose Enoch Powell fans, you just have to describe them. Seeing Enoch Powell fans move back into the mainstream of the British public conversation, seeing the kind of racism I genuinely thought, I was so naive, really, such a sheltered life I've led in so many ways, just sort of thinking, oh, don't be daft, it couldn't happen here. Whereas Jewish people almost all grow up knowing that it could happen here, it has happened here, or it will happen here. And that's why Israel is unique, I think, on the world stage in the minds of Jewish people. Now, I can say that. I can also say that the treatment of the Palestinian people since the creation of Israel has been abominable. And that is a responsibility for the international community. You can hold both positions, but if you hold both positions, you're probably just going to spend your life going around in circles. People choose a position. And people who've chosen the pro-Palestinian position almost inevitably end up speaking about Israel in a way that can be construed as anti-Semitic. That's Jeremy Corbyn's problem. That is his problem. His historic support, very vociferous support for the Palestinian people, it's very hard to distinguish from anti-Semitic criticism of the Israeli people. That's his problem. How does he fix it? How does he reassure you that he hasn't gone too far down one road to the exclusion of the other? It's 10:39. Ian is in Watford. Ian, what would you like to say?
Oh, that was very nice listening to you.
Oh, you're very kind.
There is a slight, it's a very, as you sort of said, made it complex. It is complex.
Yes.
In a number of ways. First of all, anti-Semitism has been something that has been innate for thousands of years. And because we are such a small community, that has probably been easiest to pick on, in a way. There is a very strange impression that if you ask most people, how many Jews do you think there are in the world? Very, very few will come up with anything like the correct answer.
Oh, yes.
It's a tiny number. And I don't think Jeremy Corbyn in himself can get rid of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, like most things, like you proved to yourself in a way, is based on ignorance. You didn't know much about Jews and Judaism and things. But
hang on a minute. I was never anti-Semitic.
No. But put it this way: you may not have been. But if the people who have influenced historically over the years had got to you and painted it that way, you may well have been just the same as many others.
And equally, because we're...
be clever enough to have gone through...
I hope so, but hang on a minute, just in the interest of balance, equally, an awful lot of people would have called me anti-Semitic simply for criticising an Israeli military campaign on the West Bank. So there is... The problems, the confusion is created from all corners.
Absolutely. Jews are paranoid. And
with good reason.
It's paranoia, like anybody who has suffered. They become paranoid. People don't go on aeroplanes if they know somebody who's been in a plane crash. So it's natural. So as I said, I don't think Jeremy Corbyn, unfortunately, his association with Palestinians and actually with causes that in many ways he has not advanced. He has not advanced anything for the Palestinians. And you made the statement about Palestinians get badly treated. There are some Palestinians get badly treated, but many, particularly the Palestinians living within Israel, get treated just like every other person living in Israel. And that's another thing of ignorance people don't have, because they haven't been to Israel and they haven't seen exactly what's happened. So it is a complex story, and it's not a happy story. You only have to go back to the fact that the one country that decided to make peace with Israel was Egypt. And shortly after that, Anwar Sadat was assassinated, not by a Jew, but by somebody of his own country.
We're jumping ahead,
but what I'm trying...
Just steer back if you can. Hang on a minute. Just tell me what Jeremy Corbyn can do to reassure you. And maybe the answer is nothing, but what can he do?
Very, very little. And because, as you say, most of these things are tweets. And unfortunately, what has happened is the Labour Party have had this great growth of people of coming in who have felt like it's their party type of thing,
yes.
And they can say what they like. And it may take time to work its way through. And as I don't think Jeremy Corbyn, I feel, is not a man for making decisions. He's making
I think you're right
about others,
yeah,
but not actually, doing anything productive. And I hope maybe I'm mistaken. I live for the fact that I don't know everything, but
that's all right. I've got that covered.
Yeah, it's very difficult. But unfortunately, again, I'm not enjoying all this media about Jeremy Corbyn.
No, I understand exactly what you're saying.
I find it upsetting.
Do you think the coverage is disproportionate and specifically with reference to Windrush?
But
actually,
the only thing I would say with regard to Windrush, if the coloured community had screamed like the Jewish community,
yes,
about the situation 2 or 3 years ago, maybe we wouldn't be in this situation we are today.
Maybe they did and we didn't. Maybe they were screaming and we didn't hear.
They didn't, because they didn't scream loud enough.
Well, I mean, you know what you're doing here.
I don't know.
You're leading us very gently and unintentionally towards something close to an observation that Jewish people are better organised and do have more access to media coverage than West Indian British people do.
Possibly.
And that, in the wrong hands, that could sound anti-Semitic.
Well, no, it's the fact that because
it
could go into long conversations about this, which I don't want to particularly. But
okay,
it maybe the media did not pick up, and I have many friends who are both West Indian and African. In fact, I'm currently, James, doing T-shirts for an African church. So just to give you the idea that I'm...
No, you didn't. You didn't say anything that I thought was in any way suspect. But of course, there is an implicit suggestion, just in that one comment that you made with regard to Windrush, is there's a degree of responsibility that lies with the victims for not being outraged or vocal enough. And
I actually, and again I say this only from sincerity. Okay, there may be historically the fact that the West End have been trodden down and did not have the ability to, where Jews maybe have risen up and then have been knocked down, they had the ability to rise. And thank God, I think we are now seeing in this generation now coloured people who are rising and showing great character and in all aspects, whether it's in films or whether it's TV or whatever. And life is a progression, you know.
It is. You said you didn't want a long conversation. You've had one. I don't think it works. It means that some of the people who've rung in will end up disappointed. But you can't have a conversation like this in snatches and sound bites. You may continue it longer than the hour, but I'm not going to curtail it unduly because the situation is complicated. And while it is desperately unfashionable at the moment, it will come back into fashion again, and we'll be better prepared than most because we'll have been doing it for years. What, James? Thinking. I know you don't think I do this often enough, but there's some very good Brexit news in today. Jacob Rees-Mogg has announced he will flee the country if the Conservative Party abandons Brexit, which, of course, it's a sort of mutually dependent position, because freedom of movement would be retained by abandoning Brexit, which would mean that Jacob could indeed flee the country and would be free to work and live in a whole host of other European nations. Jacob Rees-Mogg will flee the country if Conservative Party abandons Brexit. 10:50. Just by way of balance, because that's obviously good Brexit news, and I should balance it out with the news from the Royal College of Nursing that the situation there is becoming quite dire with the number of qualified nurses from the EEA and EU fleeing the country and not being replaced. It is pretty bleak, actually. 805 nurses or midwives from the European Economic Area registered to work in 2017-18. 3,962 left. Well done, everyone. Back to Jeremy Corbyn and what he can do to assuage, address, diffuse the shadow of anti-Semitism that hangs over him and his party. I think, for the record, it's important to remember that historically you will find more anti-Semitism on the right wing of Western politics, of European politics, than you will on the left wing. But Jeremy Corbyn's problem is specific to what people who profess to be his supporters both say and believe. So we can speed up the investigations. One of the other suggestions is that people who have been accused, people who are being investigated, should somehow be barred from platforms or shouldn't be invited to speak. I've got a slight problem with that, to be honest with you, because it seems to subvert the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. So we can speed up the processes. The problem with that is that process is usually called due process, and if you speed it up, it ceases to be due. So all of these things, the more you talk about them, the more difficult they become to define. 10:52 is the time. John is in Cork. John, what would you like to say?
Right, you may not like this answer. Right, first, I'm Irish, born in the Republic. When we were growing up, it was always, every election, everyone was cheering on Labour, because Labour were seen as the nice guys and the Tories are bad, right? Corbyn's he has no choice. He has to resign. Because I'll tell you why. You have been, and rightly so, giving out about Theresa May and Windrush for the last couple of days. Okay? But here's the point, and it comes back to one thing. 2 years ago, the Chakrabarti report cleared Labour of any anti-Semitism. There was none. Do you remember that? Do you remember Ruth Sneak at the actual launch of the report being attacked using anti-Semitic language?
I don't remember it clearing Labour of anti-Semitism. I thought it made recommendations to address anti-Semitism that haven't been implemented.
But there was no major problem. Suddenly there's a major problem. And you have a situation...
And why does that lead to Jeremy Corbyn's resignation?
It's bad leadership. He's not anti-Semitic. I don't believe he is. I don't think he is, but I think he's a very poor leader. He is allowing that poison, however, to mark Labour. I mean, Josh Simons actually warned Chakrabarti that there was anti-Semitic views being held by people around Jeremy Corbyn. That was not mentioned. That was ignored.
They made 20 recommendations on tackling anti-Semitism and racism. That report. It didn't conclude that there wasn't any.
No, but it wasn't that bad a problem. If you remember, it was kind of like, yes, we're going to sort it out. Suddenly, it's becoming
abusive references to any particular person or group based on actual or perceived physical characteristics and racial or religious tropes and stereotypes should have no place in Labour Party discourse. These epithets include the terms such as Zio and Paki. Labour members should resist the use of Hitler, Nazi and Holocaust metaphors, distortions and comparisons in debate about Israel-Palestine in particular. There should be procedural rule changes to improve the party's disciplinary process and the adoption and publication of a complaints procedure. The appointment of a general counsel to the Labour Party to give advice on issues including disciplinary matters and to take responsibility for instructing external lawyers. The party should increase the ethnic diversity of its staff. The report rejects the idea of a lifetime membership ban from the party for anyone deemed to have used racist language and suggests a moratorium on retrospective comments. That is not, to my mind, evidence that it concluded there wasn't a problem, John.
Okay, and to your mind, and I'm not being sarcastic, what's happened in the last 2 years?
That's not what you said, though, is it? You rang in to say that the report concluded that there wasn't a problem, and that's why he had to resign.
I didn't say there wasn't a problem. I said that they said, oh, it's not that bad. Suddenly,
well, it sounds pretty bad to me. If they're addressing Holocaust metaphors, they're addressing the use of Hitler and Nazi distortions in debates about Israel-Palestine, they're calling for an appointment of a general counsel. It's a very odd response to a problem they decided wasn't that bad.
I'm going to ask you one question.
Well, okay. It's probably easier for you than answering mine.
Would you agree? No, but would you agree that in the last 2 years, suddenly anti-Semitism has become a problem in Labour?
No, I wouldn't. I think a lot of the evidence, particularly from Jeremy Corbyn's membership of various Facebook groups, predates his leadership.
But you see, what I'm saying to you is the problem is getting worse. Supporters think they can say what they like on social media.
And that's Jeremy Corbyn's fault because he's the leader of the party, and he is the person. So if we replace the leader of the party and the comments continue, that would be the new leader's fault, would it?
No.
Why not?
What I'm saying is the supporters...
No, hang on. Why not?
Because the people who are attracted to the party are following the man.
Ed Miliband was leader of the party when a lot of these pro-Palestinian groups were posting stuff that Jeremy Corbyn is now being asked to answer for. So was Ed Miliband responsible for those anti-Semitic comments on the pro-Palestinian Facebook pages? Well, make your mind up, mate, because either the leader is responsible or he's not.
No.
Unless, of course, he's only responsible when it's Jeremy Corbyn, but everyone else gets a free pass.
No, sorry, James. Ed Miliband was Jewish. Okay? Ed Miliband was Jewish.
He still is.
Yes, I know that. But here's the point I'm trying to say is, when Ed Miliband was... You didn't have rampant anti-Semitism in the Labour ranks.
You did, actually. An awful lot of the evidence being used against Jeremy Corbyn predates his leadership. It was membership, pre-leadership of pro-Palestinian Facebook pages that has actually led the assault upon Jeremy Corbyn's camp for being anti-Semitic. You can't change the history, mate. You can't change the facts. So those posts that you're referring to were put on the internet when Ed Miliband was leader of the party. You think Jeremy Corbyn should resign because people have put anti-Semitic posts on social media under his leadership. Ergo, by any law of recognisable logic, whether he's Jewish or Zoroastrian or a Klingon, Ed Miliband should resign because people were posting anti-Semitic stuff on pro-Palestinian Labour Facebook pages when he was the Labour leader.
And if that is the case,
It's not if, that is the case. We know that's the case.
If that is the case, then Labour has a serious problem with anti-Semitism.
Well, except that, everything else you've said has turned out not to be true.
So you're now saying that Josh Simons didn't tell Chakrabarti?
No, I'm not familiar with the episode you describe. I'm only familiar with the things that you've said to me today, and they've all turned out to be a little bit weak. And to begin by claiming that a man has to resign and to end up not really knowing why
he has to resign.
Okay, well, I sense you're going to carry on believing that, despite the fact that all your evidence for believing it has just fallen apart like a cheap suit. Stuart's in Putney. Stuart, what would you like to say?
I'd like to say that I think you're being very generous to Corbyn because of his past history. The problem is not what he's doing now and not what he's done since he's been leadership since he's been leader particularly. It's the past history which you just can't get out of. And this thing blew up recently because of the mural and the Facebook page. But then you have the...
Which happened when Ed Miliband was leader, didn't it? So under the last fella's logic, and I'm not going to hold you to John's logic, but under John's logic, Ed Miliband should have resigned because of anti-Semitic stuff being put on a Facebook page somehow affiliated or associated with the Labour Party.
I kind of agree that he shouldn't be held responsible for everyone who posts on Twitter, but I think it's...
You kind of agree that he shouldn't be held responsible for...
Okay, I do agree. Okay, but
categorically, completely and explicitly agree he can't be held responsible for anything except what he has said and done himself.
And he's done enough by himself.
Okay.
What he's done himself. So one thing is, during the referendum debate, he would not share a platform with David Cameron because he was a Tory, but yet he has...
That's not really evidence of anti-Semitism, is it?
If you just maybe make my point. He has shared a platform with Paul Essen, who was a Holocaust denier, not once, but twice. So that's sort of a twisted logic. Would you not agree?
No, I wouldn't. I'm not as qualified on this as you are, clearly. If he knew the man was a Holocaust denier when he shared a platform with him, then he is an absolute cretin. And it does compromise his credentials to lead the party, but it happened before he was leader of the party. So you could say he never should have been elected, in which case you'd be denying democracy. Or you could say he has to stand again for election in the full knowledge that he stood on a platform with a Holocaust denier. I'm fairly confident he would say, I had no idea he was a Holocaust denier. And if you're Jeremy Corbyn, you've shared a platform with the world and his wife over the last 40 years.
I think you're being really, really generous to him and giving him the benefit of the doubt.
So you are on the record accusing him of knowingly sharing a platform with a Holocaust denier?
Yes.
Okay. And you've got proof of that?
You need to do some research.
No, you've got proof of that?
You just need to look at... Yeah, I can send it in to you.
OK, well, I look forward to it, because otherwise you could get sued for that. It's coming up to, or just turned 11 o'clock, being overly generous to Jeremy Corbyn, or being part of the Zionist conspiracy to undermine the absolute boy by smearing him with anti-Semitism accusations. Well, about 50-50 today. I took Stuart's advice. I've done some research. I've found references to Jeremy Corbyn, and I'm pretty sure that the fella... Stuart mentioned was called Paul Eisen, E-I-S-E-N. Labour leadership contender Jeremy Corbyn has dismissed ludicrous and wrong suggestions he would knowingly have associated with Holocaust deniers. I can't find any evidence, Stuart, that he shared a platform with him twice. Paul Eisen himself has said that Jeremy Corbyn attended some of their events. 15 years ago, Corbyn says Eisen was not a Holocaust denier. Had he been a Holocaust denier, I would have had absolutely nothing to do with him. I was moved by the plight of people who had lost their village in Deir Yassin. Holocaust denial is vile and wrong. The Holocaust was the most vile part of our history. The Jewish people killed by the Nazi Holocaust were the people who suffered the most in the 20th century. Paul Eisen claimed that Corbyn had got his checkbook out at a fundraising meeting. This, of course, predating any evidence that Eisen was a Holocaust denier. And Corbyn responded by saying if he did ever donate any money at all, it would have just involved throwing coins in buckets. And that was back in August of 2015 that report was written. So I look forward to Stuart's submissions of evidence that Jeremy Corbyn knowingly shared a platform with someone he knew to be a Holocaust denier. Otherwise, I shall apologise on Stuart's behalf for that calumny and libel. It's 6 minutes after 11. I'll take a couple more calls on this because I find it genuinely fascinating. And I know I'm a little bit guilty sometimes of patting myself on the back too often. But you can have these conversations. You can have detailed, complicated conversations about detailed, complicated issues. You don't just have to pick a side and start shouting at each other. There is a problem in the Labour Party. It's a problem that comes into focus when pro-Palestinian rhetoric clashes with anti-Israeli rhetoric and the conflation of anti-Israeli rhetoric with anti-Semitism. Now, some pro-Israeli people are responsible for that conflation. Some people who accuse anyone who criticises an Israeli military campaign or the shooting of an innocent civilian. That is anti-Semitic. And I get now why you reach immediately for that, because you have to keep Israel safe. But it doesn't make you right, either morally or politically or historically. And the frustration on the other side of that divide, what we'll loosely describe as the pro-Palestinian position, the frustration is that their message, their story, their facts seem to be often overlooked and ignored. Jeremy Corbyn, if he's guilty of anything, is guilty of leaning too far in one direction. It doesn't make him anti-Semitic. You could argue that it makes him excessively pro-Palestinian. So where is the Labour Party's anti-Semitism problem? Well, it's clear, I think, that it lies in a perception. And I'm going to refer back to that tweet that I got this morning, and then we're going to move on after 1:15, which showed three IDF soldiers apparently shooting at Palestinian protesters and sort of laughing and joking when they thought they'd hit one. It's fairly barbaric behaviour. And the tweet didn't say, James, why don't you talk about this? It said, why can't you talk about this? Now, the person that sent it probably didn't realise he was being anti-Semitic, simply suggesting that we wouldn't talk about it because our strings are being pulled. And that is a perception that is quite widespread. And one of our Jewish callers earlier accidentally stumbled into a similar position when talking about Windrush and suggesting that the Caribbean people who have been subjected to this appalling terrorising policy of Theresa May's could have been better organised and created more of a rumpus. An awful lot of people have been in touch with me saying, we have been organised, we have been screaming about this for years, nobody would listen to us. To be honest, it's been in The Guardian for 6 months, and it's only last week that Theresa May and Amber Rudd appeared to notice. So the idea that the Jewish lobby, which is not a phrase I like, is better organised and more effective than other representatives of black and minority ethnic groupings is probably shared by people who wouldn't agree on much at all. But it's not evidence of anti-Semitism. The evidence of anti-Semitism lies in some of the stuff that is posted and written in Jeremy Corbyn's name. If it's happened on Twitter, it's impossible to prove that the people that did it are Jeremy Corbyn. It's usually impossible to prove. So it seems to me that he's got a problem that he's being ordered to fix, but the people ordering him to fix the problem, as I think today's programme has suggested, if not proved, the people ordering him to fix a problem struggle actually, when you scratch the surface of this story, to describe precisely what the problem is. Except for the people in the party with names and identities who stand accused of anti-Semitic language or behaviour being investigated, which is happening, but people argue it should be happening more quickly. And I think that's all that we could really chalk up as substantive at this point in proceedings. Stuff is going on, but it needs to be quicker. And then I'd ask you why this is getting so much coverage, and Windrush, for which no politician is being held responsible at the moment, is getting less. That's just odd, isn't it? Thomas is in Huddersfield. Thomas, what would you like to say?
Hiya, James. How are you doing? You well?
Yeah, I think so, mate. Thanks for inquiring. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you.
Carry on.
I was just calling in, and it's not to ask a specific question as such, but it's just to put an opinion forward.
Yeah.
And that opinion's that I've been following this scandal as someone who's a descendant of a Palestinian refugee.
Okay.
I've always thought that Jeremy Corbyn is handling himself in this as very, very apologetic, and and I think that it would be, more beneficial to his cause as someone who is, who has spoken out against the state of Israel in the past,
yes,
to define the lines that are between anti-Semitism in its pure form and what is, speaking out against the state of Israel.
Or being vocally pro-Palestinian.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
But this is a really good contribution. So he should be really using this to clarify and therefore solve problems.
Yeah, and I think that it sort of would make his case a lot stronger, and it would make it more of a discussion that was in his favour, if you know what I mean. If it that goes along with his rhetoric that he's put out in the past, you know what I mean?
I do, and I'm going to paint a target on my backside now, Thomas. Just to give you a warning in advance, I don't think he is bright enough to pull that off.
Right.
I think that there's a fleetness of foot intellectually that would demand, and it's not something I've seen.
The other thing is, I've spoken about this with people before, and sort of said, why is it that you can't do this? Why is it that you can't turn it around and say, well, actually, it isn't anti-Semitism, it's this. And the reason is because it's an unelectable position.
I think it's simpler. I think we'll see.
Going to get him into trouble.
PMQ's coming up later today. It's the same problem. It's because it's not what he does. And this isn't, I suppose saying he's not bright enough is a criticism. So maybe I'll withdraw that. But he doesn't have that fleetness of foot, that speed of thought, which isn't necessarily a requisite for good leadership of a country. You know, William Hague was brilliant at PMQs. It never got him over the line as Prime Minister, but that is why he can't take these. This is what frustrates me the most about him, and it upsets his supporters when I say this, but he could be here now, railing against Windrush. He'd have to answer some questions about anti-Semitism. That goes with the territory. And then he could have the floor. He could be on Channel 4 News tonight. He could be on the news at 10. He could be on GMTV. He could be on Richard and Judy, showing my age a bit there. He could be on every single remotely news-based programme in the country, sticking it to Theresa May. And he isn't, because he knows he's not very good at it. And that is a problem. It's a problem if you wanted to win an election, and it doesn't matter how many chants you've got or how much support you've got on social media. That's what frustrates me. You've got, I think, the worst government in living memory, and a leader of the opposition who struggles to land a single punch when he should be knocking them out every morning, shouldn't he?
You know, and this is something, James, that I got really excited about when Jeremy Corbyn was first elected leader of the Labour Party. I thought, finally, someone who's going to speak out on behalf of Palestine from a leader's point of view, and someone
he
who
hasn't,
can legitimately be the Prime Minister. And he's failed to deliver, and I think that is because he worries so much about the fact that he wants to be the Prime Minister.
Well, he avoids confrontation as well, which is a very odd thing to do, because this is the time for confrontation. The following, the big committed supporters tell me that we are worrying unduly, and that he is making all these cases and making all these points in other forums. When I suggest that he really should be out there every day, they say he wouldn't get a fair hearing. MSM, mainstream media. The problem with that is these forums seem to me to be populated exclusively by people that are already persuaded. Well,
as you say, James, it's slightly weak. He could bring that debate into the foreground of what he says, and into the big platforms that he's asked to speak on. You know, and I think that it would be something that could really get him out of this scandal, to unblur the lines of how he feels about the state of Israel and how he feels about, you know, the plight of the Jewish people, if he does.
Well, I'm inclined to agree with you, although, as ever on this issue, I feel I don't have the personal investment that you have or that a Jewish person would have, but that possibly qualifies me to be quite a good referee. And speaking of referees, a few people have sent me the YouGov polling that I was alluding to when I mentioned that historically right-wing parties have a much bigger problem with anti-Semitism than left-wing parties. But you are misunderstanding it, Mr. Bazzy McBazface and others, because this is the polling of Labour voters. It's not evidence of a problem within a party. It's a problem amongst support for a party. Jeremy Corbyn's problem is with people who are members of Labour being accused of anti-Semitism. But for the record, the two YouGov polls, one in 2015, one in 2017, show not only that Conservative voters historically are more likely to hold anti-Semitic views. For example, having a connection to Israel makes Jewish people less loyal to Britain than other British people. Jewish people consider themselves to be better than other British people. Compared to other groups, Jewish people have too much power in the media. In 2015, 19% of Conservative voters agreed with that, and 17% of Labour voters. Fast forward to 2017, after 2 years of Labour leadership, and the figures have gone down on both sides, but they've gone down by more on the Labour side. So under Labour voting people, anti-Semitic views have declined since Jeremy Corbyn was leader. But that unfortunately doesn't prove that Labour Party members who've been posting stuff on social media or abusing Labour Party MPs in anti-Semitic ways, using anti-Semitic language, hasn't increased on his watch. So again, in the interests of balance and honesty, it is true. I'd go further and say I suspect that there's a reason why this YouGov polling isn't more widely disseminated. It doesn't suit the Get Corbyn narrative that is very much underway at the moment. But the Conservative Party voters are more anti-Semitic than the Labour Party voters, and under Jeremy Corbyn's 2 years of leadership, the number of Labour Party voters telling YouGov that they hold anti-Semitic views has gone down. But he's still got a problem.